Hey you guys, it's Shannon from That DIY Couple. As a lot of you know, I have recently lost 100 pounds. I used to look like this, and now I look like this. So a lot of you have asked how I did it. I've made a couple of different videos on this subject, but one that you're all asking about is for a more thorough summary of the book Bright Line Eating by Dr. Susan Peirce Thompson. So here it is, you guys. I'm gonna lay out for you the key lessons and takeaways in this book. I'm gonna cite a lot of the science that she talks about in the book and some of my general observations about it. And I really hope that it serves as a helpful resource for you that you can consult when you need a summary of what you've read, or you can share with someone who you think might be interested in learning the key takeaways from this incredibly successful and intuitive weight loss program. There's two things that I want to say right at the outset. The first is that I'm not compensated in any way by Susan Peirce Thompson or Bright Line Eating, and the views expressed in this video are entirely my own. I'm going to try to summarize this book, but I could be totally wrong about, and I could misrepresent or misquote it. These are my takeaways and thoughts and synthesis of what was presented in the book. Speaking of which, the research in this book could be wrong. I'm not a scientist, I'm a lawyer. I don't know if what she says in here is true, but for me at least, I bought it, hook, line, and sinker, and I have never looked back. I've never felt better. So there might be like other studies that refute some of the things that are cited here, but you know what? I'm not worried about it because I've lost a ton of weight this way and I feel great. Let's see, one more thing. I'm not a doctor. You should talk to yours before you change your dietary plan. And if you are someone who has struggled with like body dysmorphia or eating disordered, I would suggest that you consider talking to whoever's treating you for that before adopting any sort of restrictive food plan. But if you're someone like me who has yo-yoed with their weight for your life and you've gained weight, you've lost it, you've tried lots and lots of diets, stay tuned. I think that you're gonna like this one. So let's get into it, you guys. All right, so the first part of Bright Line Eating is sort of the setup. It has a prologue by John Robbins, who's a leader in health and nutrition. He's the guy who, his last name is Robbins from the Baskin-Robbins empire, who sort of walked away from a lot of money and an ice cream empire when he realized that the products that his family was selling and getting rich off of were really hurting people's health and making them sick. And he started what's called the Food Revolution Network, which is a really interesting website and symposium that has a lot of great leaders and thinkers in nutritional science and many different fields come together to talk about health and wellness. And he's just sort of like a respected, incredible figure in the sort of health movement that's happening now. So the prologue is by him, and it basically establishes that Susan Peirce Thompson is awesome and that this program worked and that a lot of people in his very many thousand strong network of people have tried this program and experienced great success on it. Interestingly, this is how I came to this book. I was listening to the Food Revolution Summit, which is a series of it's a series of authors and thinkers who come together and they talk about their work. And Susan Peirce Thompson spoke, and I was like, this makes sense. So I downloaded the audiobook, and my life was changed by Bright Line Eating from there on out. Okay, so the first chapter is Susan's story. So it establishes credibility with her. Essentially, she is I believe her title is like a brain and cognitive science. I'm probably not going to get it exactly right, but basically she studies neuroscience. She has a PhD in this area, and she has at various times been a tenured professor in this area. She's left and then I think come back to like pursue Bright Line Eating more fully. But essentially, she's like a really smart cookie. I think she studied at one of the UC schools, and then she went on to be a professor at like the University of Rochester or something like that. But she herself is a former recovering drug addict. So it's a really interesting, she has a really interesting perspective on brain science, and she looks at things from the lens of someone who has experienced addiction, which I don't think you get a lot of that. I don't think you get a lot of like PhDs in brain and cognitive sciences who have themselves like done heroin, or like, I guess she said she hasn't done heroin, but she did like many other drugs. So, you know, it talks about her childhood, growing up, feeling like a pull towards a lot of sugary and sweet foods, and then eventually being like a very precocious student, and eventually falling into depression and experimenting with drugs, starting with mushrooms at a young age, and eventually becoming like a full-on drug addict by the time that she was, you know, in high school. And then her sort of miraculous recovery therefrom, and her renewed interest in neuroscience and specifically the study of addiction, and then her lifelong struggles with being off of drugs but being addicted to flour and sugar, and being sort of overweight, and realizing that flour and sugar sort of play a role in the body that's similar to you know, other drugs, essentially, as she calls them. So this is like a very, I think, unique story. And when I forcefully sat my mom down and asked her to listen to the Bright Line Eating audiobook with me, as one does when they are becoming a little bit evangelical about something that they feel is like a good thing in the world and has changed their lives. My mom found this very alienating, because she was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to take from this. Like, this person is like, you know, had like a very unique life experience. I'm not sure this is relatable. However, when I read this, I was like, wow, what an interesting person, you know, what a successful person, and what a different take on the study of the human brain. Okay, so the promises in the first that are sort of laid out at the beginning of this book are that she's going to explain to you how the human brain evolved at a time before the modern availability of processed foods, and how the current glut of like very calorie dense, very calorie heavy and processed foods the brain is actually maladapted to process that. And while we are very good at surviving in times of few available calories, our bodies are actually not great at surviving in times of like feast, because we start to develop diseases which are related to our diets, which, you know, eventually kill us. So, you know, her basic premise is that the standard American diet has the potential to really hijack critical functions in our brain, which were great at helping us survive when times were rough and things were scarce, but now today cause us to gain excess weight and stay overweight. And the promise of the program that she lays out is that it actually sort of rewires your brain to stop the brain from blocking weight loss and get you into a place where you're doing good habits automatically, so that you can release the excess weight that you need to and live, as she says, happy, thin, and free. One, I think, side note criticism to her sort of mantra of being happy, thin, and free is that I think it sort of in an unhealthy way couches thin in between two other really good things, which are happy and free. And that seems a little fat shaming to me. Like, I feel like you can be happy and free and be fat. But I would say, you know, healthy, I would say happy, healthy, and free. I think that would be probably like a better mantra. Anyway. So, you know, the first half of Bright Line Eating provides a really accessible, fascinating, science-based summary of how the brain blocks weight loss and the standard American diet hijacks our brains to keep us fat. And it goes a long way to clarifying why we have a huge global problem with obesity, diabetes, and heart disease in the United States, but also growing globally. Why most people struggle with their diets and yo-yo for their entire lives. Why most diets fail, and only 0.01% of people who have lost 30 pounds keep it off for 5 or more years. Which is a statistic that, when I heard it in this book, was like, that's really disheartening. But the promise that she sort of lays out is that the people in her program, you know, are able to keep it off. So chapter 1 is about how the brain blocks weight loss. So the idea is that our brains evolved a really long time ago, at a time when food was scarce. And so right now, when food is plentiful in the developed world, if you're lucky enough to live in a country where you're, you know, have to worry about getting too much food, which we should all count our blessings for having that privilege, it makes you fat and you're unhealthy and sick. So one of the first lessons that she talks about is this thing called the willpower gap. So people, when they think about willpower, they think it's something that you can marshal and muster and, like, you know, muster all your willpower, and then you should be able to eat less and move more in order to lose weight. But so that framing of what willpower is really puts the onus on you to be strong enough and smart enough to do these things. And it really, like, essentially leads people to, if you believe this, you might believe about yourself, if you're fat, that you're just, you know, lazy, or there's something wrong with you just can't get it together. And other people might think this too, if they believe that that's what willpower is. But interestingly, Susan points out that the science shows that willpower is actually a mental faculty in your brain, which runs on glucose and gets exhausted during the course of a day by doing things like checking your email, or dealing with people's, you know, problems around you, or moderating your emotions so that you are a nice person instead of saying exactly what you think. So we all begin the day, per Susan, with an amount of willpower. It's replenished by sleep, it's replenished by meditation, it's replenished by glucose, you know, sugar in the brain, you know, gratitude and thankfulness. All these things, like, apparently replenish the willpower, and studies have shown this, that you have in your brain, and the ability to moderate yourself in one area or another. And then sort of starts to get depleted. So by the end of the day, we are often left with what's called decision fatigue, where we're like, oh, I just can't make even one more decision. Or you start the day with the best of intentions, you want to stay on plan, you want to stay on your diet, but by the end of the day, you're so wiped that you say, oh, you know what, let's just order a pizza. Let's order pad thai. And you make sort of a bad decision about food when you most need it at the end of the day. So willpower lives in the anterior cingulate cortex of the brain. It gets fatigued through everyday living, decision making, and we really only have about 15 minutes or so that we can use at a time. So the support that Susan cites for this premise is an interesting study called the Radish Experiment, where this guy named Roy Baumeister basically had people come in hungry in, like, a fasted state and sit at a table. When they entered the room, the smell of cookies, freshly baked cookies, were there. And they had to sit at this table, and there was either cookies and candies on the table or radishes. And they were told, please don't touch the cookies and candies. They're for another experiment. And they had to wait there for a period of time. Or they were told the same thing about the radishes. Please don't touch the radishes. They're for another experiment. And then they were told that they were going to do a series of really difficult, impossible to solve math puzzles. And so what was interesting was that the people who had been resisting the cookies and the candies did, like, 8 minutes less of working on these math problems before they gave up, which was a statistically significant amount. Basically, what he showed was that by resisting this food, they had less willpower to exercise on this other difficult task. So it was like the first time that they showed that, like, there was this finite resource of our willpower. But this, you know, makes sense, right? This makes, like, obviously at the end of, like, a terrible day, you feel more inclined to make bad decisions. Another interesting study that she cites about willpower is that inmates coming up for parole only had a 15% chance of getting parole if the judge is due for a snack. If they have their meeting with a judge after the judge has presumably had a snack, it shoots up to a 65% chance. So this is tragic for the criminal justice system, but also really interesting because it shows that, possibly it could potentially show that the judge is like replenishing their willpower on their break, and then they are more, they're in a better state when they come out of it. So another interesting Baumeister experiment with Hoffman was that they showed that people spend on average about 4 hours per day resisting some sort of temptation, like sleep, sex, but mostly people spend their day resisting food. So the interesting thing about the anterior cingulate cortex, which is where the willpower sits in the brain, is that it's really sensitive to glucose fluctuations. So at the end of the day, when our blood sugar level is lowest, is when we typically tend to make bad decisions about food. One thing that this made me think about is the fact that I'm a real stress eater, and so I used to feel about food that I needed to power myself, I needed food to power myself through difficult situations. So when I was working at a really big law firm in New York, I gained a ton of weight because I was constantly stressed and also faced with a lot of difficult tasks. And every time I needed to start a new project, I was like, I better have something to eat. And considering that willpower and runs on glucose, this seems like a natural reaction for someone who's a stress eater. So other diets fail. This is the key. Other diets fail because they rely on your willpower to implement them. And our willpower will naturally wax and wane depending on a variety of factors, including how much we've slept, how stressed we are, how long the day has been, how much other difficult stuff we have to deal with. And so this makes sense, right? We start diets when we're lifelong yo-yoers. We start diets with a lot of willpower. We'll be in a good place with willpower, and we'll start the diet and we'll adhere to it for a period of time, and then something will happen and we'll fall off the bandwagon. So the promise of bright line eating is that it takes your willpower out of the equation, because you may or may not have any at any given time when you need it and when it's time to make a decision. Instead, what the book promises is to take your eating into the realm of automaticity. So there's a different part of the brain, right? There's a decision-making, thinking, deciding part of the brain, which is, requires some willpower. But then there's this other part of the brain, which doesn't require willpower, which is the part of the brain that when you wake up in the morning and you do whatever it is, the first thing that you have to do in the morning, that you do in the morning, for me, it's checking my phone. So I don't wake up every morning and think, today's the day I'm gonna check my phone. Or today's the day I'm gonna empty my bladder. Or today's the day I'm gonna brush my teeth first thing in the morning. For some people, it's I'm gonna go downstairs and have coffee. You don't think to yourself, you don't have to make a decision there, because you're doing those things automatically. And so Susan's goal for this program is to make your eating automatic in the same way that brushing your teeth, hopefully, is automatic for you at this point in your life. And that's, I think, the key as to why this program works. The real helpful takeaway from this chapter is that if you're overweight, it's not because you're weak-willed. It's because you have a human brain that is reacting to food and stressors of modern living in a way that causes you to gain weight. You fall prey to what she calls the willpower gap. So the limitations about the way we are wired and stressors help make us make bad food choices. These set off a cascade of activity, which in turn triggers another concept, which she calls insatiable hunger, and a third concept, which she calls overpowering cravings. So chapter 2 is about insatiable hunger. So the basic premise of chapter 2 and insatiable hunger is the idea that people who are overweight, unlike people who are in a healthy, body, are actually more hungry and have a hard time getting full. And this is because leptin, the hormone which makes you feel like you're done eating, you're satiated, it's time to get out, it's time to move. Leptin, which is released into the blood during the course of a meal, is actually being blocked at the brainstem by a different hormone called insulin, which is the hormone sometimes called the key hormone, which is released after you've eaten and is particularly released after you've eaten things like sugar and flour. So let's summarize that again. Overweight people continue to feel hungry because the hormone which normally tells them they're full is not being recognized by the brain because we have too much insulin in our systems. So hunger, the feeling of feeling hungry, is an important part of surviving, right? But because our brains evolved when food was scarce, the processed food and the availability of it now isn't suited for our brain chemistry. So we can adapt to survive when we don't have food, but when we have too much food all the time, it literally breaks our brains. So insatiable hunger, she says, compels us to eat even if we're full. It's why we keep eating chips even after we're full. Like, it's why we can't stop with the Pringles. It's why, you'll have dessert even though you're already stuffed. And unlike regular hunger, which helped us survive, which tells us to get out and do things and hunt and produce and fix the hunger problem, this type of hunger actually makes us tired, and it makes us want to stay sedentary. So previously on human evolution, food was a biological signal to get moving, hunger was a biological signal to get moving, and now hunger is like, I want to just binge and then watch a bunch of Netflix and sleep. This triggers sluggishness. So eating doesn't satisfy it. In fact, there's been studies which show that overweight people actually get hungrier over the course of a meal and end the meal as hungry as when they started it. So we used to have this mechanism called compensation, which was supposed to govern how we regulate calories. And kids typically still have this. They'll eat less at one meal, and then they'll eat more at another meal until they get to a balanced place with it. But today, when we're overweight, we don't have as much compensation. So one study that she cites, which is really interesting, is that I think it was this guy at Cornell, I think it was Professor Wansink at Cornell University, took self-filling soup bowls. So he had this soup bowl that would imperceptibly fill up from the bottom, and he would ask people to eat, and they could they'd be eating, and then it would kind of just stay a little bit full. And people were more likely to determine when they were full based on the amount of soup in the bowl and not how much they actually eat. So we're using the size of the bowl and what we see as a proxy for whether or not we're full. So for one group, he had them eat a regular bowl of soup. And for another group, he had them eat a lot more than the bowl of soup. But he stopped them after the first group. When they finished the regular bowl of soup, he'd say, "Are you full?" And they would say, "Yes." Then the second group, who had more stuff in the soup bowl, he would stop them in the middle when they had eaten the same amount as the first group, and he would say, "Are you full?" And they'd say, "What do you mean? Of course I'm not full. I haven't finished my soup yet," even though those two groups had the same amount. So the basic takeaway here is that we're not very good at judging how much we need to eat or how much we have eaten. So, why are we fat? She proposes a couple of different potential reasons why we might be. Some people think it's because food is a lot more calorie dense now. It used to be that if you ate a large amount of food, it was sort of roughly associated with how many calories it had in it, but now it's really easy with things like Oreos or fast food to eat a small amount of food but still have it be really calorie dense. Another culprit she thinks might be artificial sweeteners, which can sort of change our hormones and our insulin. But one of the key lessons is that there's this hormone that regulates hunger in the brain called leptin. The hypothalamus in the brain is like our internal thermostat. It secretes hormones which stimulate the pituitary gland and controls things like hunger, body temperature, sex drive, parenting attachment, fatigue, sleep, circadian rhythms, thirst. All of this is sort of seated in the hypothalamus. So leptin is secreted by the hypothalamus in order to control hunger. And we discovered it when in the 1940s, a colony of mice was sort of genetically, like by a glitch, came out without any leptin. And these mice would just eat and eat and eat. And the only way to get them to move was if you moved the food trough, they would sort of waddle over to the food trough. And so it took a really long time for scientists to figure out what was going on with these mice. But eventually, many, many years later, a scientist discovered that back in the 40s, there had been this weird genetic mutation and this hormone was missing from these mice. So they were able to extract the hormone leptin, put it in the mice, and eventually they got thin. They started working out, they started going on the little hamster wheel and things like that. So they weren't weak-willed. They didn't need a diet and exercise moderation campaign. They just needed more of this hormone. Unfortunately, we can't inject ourselves with leptin and have ourselves lose weight. People have tried. Because what happened with these mice was that they didn't have anything. What's happening in our bodies is that leptin is circulating in our bodies. Our body is making it as it should, with the hormone that says, stop eating, you're full, get moving. But instead, insulin, this other hormone, is actually functioning to block leptin at the brainstem. The brainstem is this part of your brain that we call the lizard brain because it's like totally not something that you can control. It's what causes you to have all your vital processes that have to keep you alive going. So, she says to do this experiment where you like hold your breath and you tell yourself, I'm gonna hold my breath for 20 minutes. You make this decision to hold your breath for 20 minutes, but you'll get to 1 or 2 or 3 minutes and eventually you will stop. You will breathe in because your brainstem sends a signal saying you must breathe at this point. So this is why this is a problem, is because we are not getting this, when we're overweight and we're insulin resistant and insulin is high, we are not getting the signal to stop eating. So this was sort of mind-blowing to me because I remember feeling continuously hungry when I was an obese person and not understanding how other people could like leave food on their plate at the end of the meal or, say like, oh, that's enough, I'm satisfied. I didn't ever feel like that. And it wasn't until I did this program that I started feeling like that again. And I was like, interesting. My leptin's back. Okay, so what's insulin? I think we've all, heard of it. We understand it's related to diabetes. But the book explains that insulin works in the following way. Like our bodies need blood sugar for energy on a cellular level. But blood sugar can't just directly enter the cells. So after you eat, your blood sugar rises. The hypothalamus says to the pancreas, it's time to release insulin into your bloodstream. Insulin attaches to the cells, which is why it's sometimes called the key hormone, because it attaches to the cells and it opens them up like a key. And it tells them to absorb the blood sugar. And it helps us by helping us control our blood sugar by getting it too high, from getting too high or too low. So the standard American diet is dramatically increasing baseline insulin levels across the board, like in all Americans. So it's not even just like we're eating more and so the insulin goes up after the meal. It's that our insulin baseline is going up. And insulin is blocking leptin at the brainstem. So the most primal part of our brain is convinced that we are starving, which leads us to reach for foods that keep our blood sugar levels elevated. So this leads to a new chapter, which she describes overpowering cravings. So we keep hitting our brains with excess stimulation, and our brains respond by causing our dopamine receptors to thin out. This makes us go out of our way for highly pleasurable, unnatural foods like cookies, ice cream or pizza, which give us our fix. So this is like when you have an uncontrollable craving for something. The other day it happened to me. I had an uncontrollable craving for a quesadilla. And I considered briefly doing a quesadilla cleanse. So overpowering cravings are a sort of binging mechanism, which cause people who struggle with leptin resistance to sort of drive out of their way to get this one specific food, which is their fix. They're going to really hit the spot. Not everybody has this, but if you're overweight, it's entirely possible that you have. So this itch in the brain, this overpowering craving, originates in the nucleus accumbens, which is the seat of pleasure in the brain. It's got pleasure, reward, motivation. It's activated by dopamine, which produces like essential activities like eating and enjoyment and sex. So the stimuli that activate the nucleus accumbens today are really different than what stimulated it when we evolved. So a good example that she uses is like the current availability of pornography versus the, furtive glances that you might see of someone across the river bathing nude like 1,000 years ago. So right now on the internet, it's possible to see like every manner of like, terrible thing in terms of pornography. And so those people who regularly watch it are overstimulated to such an extent that their dopamine receptors can thin out, causing them to want sort of like more and more of the same. And it's the same with food. So if we constantly give ourselves this really high, like rich, nutrient dense, calorie dense, bread and sugar and flour, we want more and more of the same, and we get less and less satisfaction of it as we eat. So this process of the receptors thinning out is called downregulation, which is how the brain reacts to overstimulation, because it says that's too much. I can't handle that level of stimulation, and they change your brain chemistry to be able to deal with it more. So if the onslaught of stimulation stops, the person starts to feel not well. And so this is the experience of drug addicts, which Susan, describes from personal experience. It's a feeling apparently of being uncomfortable between using. And this is something that I can relate to with food, because I used to feel like not great in between meals. I would be sort of focused on the next meal. So this leads to her really big, stunning conclusion, which is that the brain processes sugar and flour in exactly the same way as it processes other drugs that are refined and purified, like cocaine and heroin. So the substances are made in the same way. You take a natural plant. For cocaine, it's the coca leaf. For heroin, it's the poppy plant. For sugar, it's sugar cane. Oftentimes, it could be beets. For flour, it could be wheat. It could be almonds. It could be yucca. It could be any number of different types of natural plant products. And then you refine, purify, extract that plant essence, and you are given, at the end of this process, a white powder, which has very potent effects on your brain. So the knee-jerk reaction here is like, oh no, how could I possibly live without sugar and flour? And this is dopamine downregulation happening in your brain. That feeling that I can't live without that. That's too good. I like that too much. Heroin and cocaine addicts feel the same way when you suggest not using heroin and cocaine. So don't worry. The important thing to remember is that dopamine receptors do regenerate, and if you cut these things from your life, eventually other normal foods will give you lots and lots of pleasure in the way that they are meant to. And when you're not eating sugar regularly, from my experience, I can tell you that like a strawberry at the peak of the season is like the best thing in the world, and that I didn't feel that way about strawberries previously. Even like bell peppers taste like so delicious and sweet. And so one thing to keep in mind, what I can tell you from personal experience of having eliminated these things from my diet, is that how you feel right now about food is not how you will always feel. you will actually come to enjoy really whole, delicious food if you follow the prescriptions in this diet. So there's lots of interesting science to back up the proposition that sugar and flour are addictive, but note that the research for flour is not as strong, although in Susan's experience, and certainly in my experience, eliminating one but not the other is a sure way to like stay fat, because they are essentially broken down. Flour has like a slightly different molecular structure, but they are both broken down to sugar in your body in the same way. So comparison, interesting couple of studies. Comparison of PET scans of the brains of obese people actually indicate that the dopamine receptors are less active than those of people addicted to cocaine. So Dr. Paul Johnson and Dr. Paul Kenny proved, at least in rats, that highly processed sugar and flour, highly processed sugared food that we eat actually causes this downregulation of dopamine receptors. So another interesting study, University of Bordeaux, Dr. Serge Ahmed showed that rats already addicted to cocaine preferred sugared water to cocaine when forced to choose between the two. And that was the same whether it was sugar or saccharin. So this sort of leads to an interesting conclusion, which is that it doesn't matter if it's actual sugar, or if it's honey, if it's stevia, if it's coconut sugar, they all have this effect on us. So Dr. Mark Heinemann, based on this study, guesses that sugar is 8 times more addictive than cocaine. So another interesting one, the Scripps research study, rats would stand on an electrified floor to get more sugar. So you can titrate sugar and measure the strength of an addiction based on how much electricity an animal is willing to withstand in order to get it. It's terrible, but it's interesting science. So they would do this. They would stand on like the same amount of electricity for sugar as they would for cocaine or heroin. So salt and fat are not addictive, but they make food more palatable. So it's important to keep straight what she's sort of proposing that you eliminate. And it's also, I think, important to clarify here that the issue is not carbs, right? So people hear about this diet and they're like, oh, it's a low carb diet, but it's not about vilifying any particular macronutrient, because it's about the processing and the refining of these plants, which make them easily absorbed by our bodies and taken up in a way that harms us. So it's not like you could chew on the sugarcane plant if you wanted to on this diet, or you could eat just like some wheat, without refining it and processing it. It's the processing that changes it. So she has an interesting, visual where she says, think of a huge block of ice on a melting pavement. Melting slowly on a hot pavement. It's gonna take a long time. Now think of ice shavings. Put them on the same pavement. They're gonna melt really quickly. So this is sort of the visual representation of the difference in the way that your body processes a whole, food product that hasn't been refined, and the way that it processes a highly processed and refined food product. There's the uptake is too fast and too strong and causes too much of an insulin response in your body. Okay, another interesting study, anticipatory expectation of food in the brains of obese people is greater than in thin people, but they don't enjoy it as much, and they feel more feelings of unhappiness between eating. So what this means, and I can relate to this, is that when you're obese, you are really, really into thinking about food and looking forward to it. But then when you eat it, you don't actually derive as much pleasure from it as someone who is of a normal weight. So this all begs the question, if we all have this human brain, which can essentially malfunction as a result of the modern American or Western diet, why aren't we all obese? And this is a great question. And I will ask you this, why aren't we all alcoholics, right? We know that alcohol has addictive properties, but some people can drink it and have a fun night out with friends, even get drunk, and then not wake up in the morning and want more. But other people will, if they have a little bit of alcohol, go on an absolute bender and be alcoholics. So there's a difference. Human traits fall along a bell curve, right? And we can tolerate different substances in different ways. Some people can have a little bit of cocaine and not become a cocaine addict. Some people can have a little bit of heroin and not become a heroin addict. Other people will steal from their grandma and end up shriveling on the side of the street and it will destroy their lives. So our brains respond to these addictive stimuli or potentially addictive stimuli differently. And this is a powerful realization. So for some people, food has an incredible pull over them, and particularly sugar and flour. And for other people, they're just not as interested in it. So she uses the example of like Brad Pitt and I think Gwyneth Paltrow being on a show on Oprah, and she asked them what their favorite food was, and it was like they had a hard time thinking about it. Like they had to like think about it a lot. And for those types of people, it's just not a focus as much as for someone else who's like chicken marsala, you know, like they have like the exact thing that they love at the tip of their tongue. So Susan has developed a scale, which she calls a susceptibility scale, which you can figure out where your results are by going to her website, which is foodfreedomquiz.com, I believe. I'll link it down below. But she basically, you take this quiz and she has figured out, like, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, how addicted your brain is to flour and sugar. And, you know, she asks a series of questions about how your behavior towards food during the worst 3-month eating period of your life. Not how you're doing now, but the worst 3-month period of your life. And that's because once these fiber tracks are laid in the brain of how you respond to these stimuli, they're sort of always there. You can rewire them and you can like not act on them, but like you always have the susceptibility to come back to it. Okay, so the food freedom scale is interesting. I'm a 9 on the scale for what it's worth, a 9 out of 10. But you could be a 1 or a 3. Basically, if you're on the lower end of the range, you're probably a little bit less interested in food. And if you're on the medium end of the range, you might be a little bit more. If you're on the high end of the range, you might have struggled with, you know, your weight your whole life. But the interesting thing to note is that you can be fat and still not have a ton of susceptibility. What that means is just that like it's going to be easier for you to cut these things from your life. And you might just have been eating the wrong things and still your brain is making you fat as a result of that, but it's not because of some like inherent like deep-seated addiction. So yeah, so take the quiz. I think it's really interesting to see where you fall. And after the quiz, it links, I think, to her, you know, various videos explaining these sorts of things, and also her, you know, programs and her sales and things like that. Okay, so what's the solution? Bright line eating. Bright line eating takes the burden off of willpower and helps you make automatic choices by giving you unambiguous boundaries that you just don't cross. So it bridges the willpower gap that she talks about, and it's basically based on the premise that it's much easier to say I'm not going to have any of that than to say I'm going to try to moderate myself and have a little bit of that, because moderation is really, really hard for many of us who are overweight. So when you say I don't eat that, there's no decision to make. It's a different part of your brain that's working. So just like you don't use drugs, you don't have, for example, sugar and flour. So bright line number 1, eliminate sugar. This means all refined forms of fructose, glucose, anything ending with ose, agave. If it's like sweet and tastes like sugar, get rid of it, because it hits our insulin system harder than our bodies were designed to withstand. So it's going to pound the dopamine receptors, which will cause you to have deregulation. It's going to lead to overpowering cravings and insatiable hunger. By eliminating it completely, your brain starts to heal, your insulin and dopamine systems come back into sync, and they can rest and recalibrate and get back to their sort of factory settings. Artificial sweeteners impact us the same as sugar, even though they have no calories. So they also cause glucose intolerance, they alter our microbe, they mimic starvation responses in the brain, and they lead to consumption later on that's even greater than now. So this includes like the natural ones, like stevia, trivia. Fresh fruit, totally okay. Natural sugar, allowed. The fructose in this fruit is protected by a fiber lattice, which slows absorption. Fruit juice is not allowed because that fiber lattice is broken down. Same as dried fruit. It's really easy to eat like a handful of dried apricots. It would be really hard to eat like an actual bundle of dried apricots. We just consume them too quickly. So when you take a vegetable or fruit, remove its fiber lattice, it's gonna hit your system just like candy. So quit it. Quitting sugar is like quitting smoking. You're going to have cravings that you're going to go away and your brain will heal, okay? It's gonna be harder if you try to do it a little bit. Just go cold turkey. Okay, bright line number 2. Eliminate all flour. It doesn't matter if it's white. It doesn't matter if it's wheat. It can be brown, wheat, oat, almond. It doesn't matter. Teff, anything. It's not about the type of plant that's going into it. It's about the way that it's processed. It's not about gluten. It's about the surface area changing of the molecule and it being taken up by your system quickly, hitting your insulin system and causing these same biological responses. So eat like a whole grain food instead, like brown rice, or, you know, quinoa or something like that. Sugar breaks down into glucose and fructose can only be processed by the liver, which leads to fatty liver disease. But flour hits all of the cells and is like a full body assault. Okay, bright line number 3, meals. Eat only at mealtime and not between. This is because it increases fat loss, improves your energy, helps you sleep. It increases autophagy, which is the process by which our cells repair themselves, and is very fascinating. If there's interested, I can do another video on autophagy. And it helps your insulin sensitivity. Now, there's another book that I really recommend called The Obesity Card, which goes way more into this. But basically, after a meal, your insulin needs to go up, and then your leptin needs to come out and tell you you're full. And then your insulin needs to go down, and it needs to stay down for a while. If it stays up because you're continually snacking and eating, you're going to continue sending your brains, pack on the pounds, put this energy away as fat. When it comes down, all these other processes can occur, like autophagy, where your cells start to repair themselves, and where your body takes a break and it's fasting, and you start to use, instead of the fuel that's been placed into your bloodstream by the fuel, you start to go to the pantry or your fat storage and use the fuel that you've stored in the past and start to really lose weight. All right, so only eat at meals. That's outline number 3. So this means that everyone who tells you you have to snack to rev your metabolism is wrong. It's also going to reduce your anxiety and intrusive thoughts around food. Okay, bright line number 4, quantities. All right, we're really bad, you guys, at judging how much food we need. All right, we go to the gym or something like that, and we like say like, oh, okay, like now I've burned 300 calories, so I should eat this much, and it's like we were wrong about it all the time. Bright line eating essentially says weigh and measure your food before you eat it so that you're not actually like having to make any sort of decision. This to me was like the hardest one because it sounds so crazy. It makes me think like, oh, it's really like insane. It's almost like eating disorder-y. Like I can't really get behind that. So to be honest, I started by eliminating sugar and flour, and that helped me lose a fair amount of weight. Then I adopted the bright line of Mealtimes, and that also helped me lose weight. But you guys, it wasn't until I adopted the bright line of quantities that I really, really, really started to lose weight, because the brain starts to make excuses, and it's like, oh, okay, like I'm not eating sugar and flour, so I can have more of this. And then you're just it's like, it's so much easier to have someone, an expert, tell you, eat this amount and this amount and this amount, and then you will lose weight, period. You will lose it at different speeds because we have different size bodies and different metabolisms, but eventually you will get down to your goal weight if you follow this system. And realizing that was like great. It's like, just trust the expert, follow it, don't think about it, it works. Anyway, this was very helpful for me. So she has prescriptive quantities as to how much you can eat. If you guys go to our website and sign up for our newsletter, we will send you the PDF summary of exactly what she says to eat. And I'm also going to send you a PDF of how I modified it at the beginning to account for my plant-based diet and my interest in intermittent fasting, which has really helped me. Intermittent fasting is the idea that you eat a certain amount of calories, the same amount of calories as you normally would, but in a time restricted period, in order to increase the process of autophagy, which is how your cells repair themselves, and which I can do another video on. So yeah, go to our website, I'll link it down below. I'm going to send you a PDF of exactly what she says to eat for these different meals, and also how I sort of modified it. A couple implementation tips. Be gentle and kind to yourself during this period where you're making all these changes. It's really hard to change your habits, and you're going to feel grouchy because your body's going through withdrawal. So be nice to yourself. Be kind. Let other people know that you might be a little bit irritable and get them on board with you. Drink a lot of water. And here's the biggie. Don't exercise. Now, she goes into a lot of detail about this, but exercise drains our limited willpower. Now, I'm assuming here that exercise would be like a new thing for you. If you exercise every single day and it's as automatic for you as waking up and drinking coffee and going to the bathroom, and it's an integral part of your day, then it's probably not taxing your willpower and you can keep doing it. If you're mentally ill and exercise provides you with like a certain amount of like help, not mentally ill, but like, let's just say you suffer with depression, and exercise makes you feel better, then you probably shouldn't stop exercising. But if everyone else, like me, if you're like, okay, I'm gonna do a diet and exercise routine this week, and it's a new thing for you, then don't do it. Just focus on your food, because we have such little willpower. We need to conserve it and focus on changing the inputs of what it is that we're eating. Now, exercise is really important for human health and well-being, and you can do it again when you get into your goal weight. But for the period of weight loss, which should be a brief period of a couple months, maybe a year, depends on how much you have to lose, you should not do it so that you can focus on the inputs. Also, when you exercise, your body kind of holds onto your fat and thinks it's in like a feast or famine mode, and there's lots of reasons why it's not great for weight loss. I know, heresy, but trust me, this works. I didn't exercise at all during the time that I lost this 100 pounds, and it's been great for me. Okay, she spends a fair amount of time talking about Brightline eating and its like history with 12-step food programs, which are essentially like Overeaters Anonymous, equivalent to Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't find this particular part of the book particularly persuasive or interesting because I don't have a history of other addictions, but if you do, you might find it interesting. But one criticism of this book that people have levied against it is that she has essentially recycled the Overeaters Anonymous food plan and sort of tailored it and packaged it in a different way, and is now sort of commercially exploiting it. I've got to say to that criticism, like, I was never going to go to an Overeater Anonymous meeting because I found it, I just would never have considered it because I've never thought about food in terms of an addiction framework, and it seems very alienating to me as someone who's not part of that 12-step community world. I mean, no offense, but it's just not, like, it would not have come naturally to me. She has packaged this in the form of a self-help book that I find incredibly intuitive. I find her incredibly endearing, and I want to support what she's doing. And I'm like, more power to her. She's done a great thing making this accessible to the masses, and she's added a lot of interesting research to back it up, and framed it in a way that makes people understand why, using her sort of unique talents, it makes people understand why this program works. All right. No, a couple of like cheery notes to get you going. So every cell in your taste buds replaces itself every 2 weeks. So you're gonna start liking better for you food, even if you don't like it now. Personally, I never liked salad or veggies. A couple of months after doing this program, I, no joke, woke up in the morning where I had previously been craving every morning sausage, egg, and cheese sandwiches. I woke up one morning and was like, dude, I need some Swiss chard right now. Like, I want some breakfast Swiss chard, which is a dark leafy vegetable that I had only had a couple of times, but like loved. You start to like things that you don't like now as your body starts to adapt to eating natural foods that we were sort of intended to eat. Okay. You might find that you set a weight loss goal, and then as you near it, you realize that you could actually lose a fair amount more than you thought was conceivable. What's really great about this program is that, like, once you understand these concepts, it's kind of like you understand like the switch of how to turn on and off your weight loss, and you start to feel like empowered and in control. And read the book for like a ton of testimonials of people who have really loved this. Drink water. You can drink herbal tea in between eating. She sort of indicates that you should try to wean yourself from caffeine, and that alcohol, and another question people often ask is alcohol allowed? Alcohol is off limits because it's essentially sugar plus ethanol, and it causes you to overeat. She's a plant-based eater, but Bright Line Eating is not a plant-based program. You can eat basically whatever you want on this program except for sugar and flour, as long as you do it in the quantities that she prescribes. A couple of things to do before you get started: go to your doctor, take your blood work, take a ton of before pictures, and then you guys just enjoy the journey. If you like this video, if you found it helpful, if you found it way too long, if you have questions, if you want more tips and tricks or more of my thoughts on this Bright Line Eating food program, please comment down below. If you found this helpful and informative, I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe to our channel to see more videos like this and give us a thumbs up. And until next time, guys, thank you so much for watching.